This video is sponsored by Adept Roll. More about them later on. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and welcome back to another episode of the best armies in Warhammer 40k, the weekly video series where we go through undefeated armies from the past weekend of competitive Warhammer 40,000 events. This is the first episode in a couple weeks because we actually skipped last week since I was over at Adepticon. Big thanks to everybody who came out and saw me at the show. But we did have some large events go down this weekend, including the Sheffield Super Major, one of the larger Super Major level events in the UK. TC, which we will certainly be discussing. So with that, let's dive into a metagame breakdown and talk about what's winning. And what's an interesting change from what we've seen in the last couple of weeks is that there is a distinct lack of Orks at the very tippy top here. That said, Orks still appear with 2 undefeated results, so certainly not dead, but that Mordecai detachment certainly has been on the downturn since it seems like a lot of players have found ways to deal with it. That said, I do think that there is a little bit of a stagnation of the metagame this time around, which I'm sure we'll talk about momentarily. Necrons are actually up here towards the top with 3 undefeated results, both at Warzone Tucker Brewing, Vanquish 2025, and the Amona Open Nationals. Aeldari also doing fairly well, all of their lists using the Ynnari sub-faction, and I'm a little bit worried that there is some stagnation within that faction even this early on into their codex's life cycle. Despite the fact that they have a lot of really cool detachments inside their codex, Ynnari is so overwhelmingly superior to most of the other detachments that you can play, and also has strong metagame considerations into those detachments like Mordecai, that it's really just drowning out all of the entire rest of the codex. Those guys went undefeated at the Sheffield Super Major, Dragon's Horde GT, and Iberian Open Barcelona, taking down 2 of the largest events of the weekend. Astra Militarum also went undefeated at the Sheffield Super Major, and we saw an X-0-1 result at the Dragon's Horde GT. Obviously, Orks still doing fairly well, both at Courage and Honor 10 and Gem Wargaming GT, both of those results unsurprisingly using the Mordecai detachment, and Ultramarines at the Salt 3 GT as well as East Anglian GT. However, they weren't the only Space Marines to have a pretty good weekend this week. Dark Angels also saw some success, going undefeated at the USA Charity Cup. With that, we have a bunch of factions represented in undefeated results, with one-offs that includes World Eaters at Bash at the Beach, Chaos Space Marines at Fool's Errand, as well as Death Guard, Tyranids also at Salt 3, Chaos Demons at Warzone Tucker Brewing, Grey Knights at the Phuket Open, and last but certainly not least, Imperial Knights at the FoolCon Singles GT. Now, if you want to watch any of these events go down, there was some coverage live over the weekend. The Iberian Open Barcelona was streamed over on Twitch at Despeligue Rapido, and if you are into more team-focused content rather than singles events, Tabletop Live was live streaming the Toronto Open Teams GT. They were live with that all weekend, and I will include links to both of these channels down in the video description. As always, if there are any more 40k streams live over the weekend that I missed, go ahead and throw them down in the video description so we can get more eyes on everyone's content. Not a lot of streaming going on this week, but next week there is going to be quite a bit more. Both Roy Games Live and I are going to be co-streaming the Battle to End Alzheimer's GT. That's going to be live on March 12th through 13th. So please go check out my coverage of that next week. And if you want to play in any GTs, you can do so online, because I just announced a new Tabletop Simulator Grand Tournament in my Discord server, where we're going to be running a 5+ round event to commemorate the sending off of the Pariah Nexus game format. This event will have prizes, both door prizes for players who play all of the rounds, as well as prizes for top placers, largely in the form of Games Workshop store credits, and will also grant points to my tournament circuit, the T5S2. I'll leave a link to that event down in the video description, and don't forget to join my Discord server, which you can find in my link tree or linked on that event page. And with that, let's get into talking about the specific lists just after a word from our sponsors.
This video is sponsored by Adept Roll. Are you tired of guessing whether or not your 40k game plan will pay off? I'm happy to introduce Adept Roll, a dice probability calculator usable on basically any mobile device. For those who haven't used these tools before, they offer a very simple plug-in system where you can input your weapon stats versus defending stats and calculate the probabilities of certain dice results or the average amount of damage that you should expect from a particular attack sequence. Adept Roll is a mobile app designed to give you precise calculations on probabilities for these attacks. It saves you the time and effort of doing the complex math and allows you to focus more heavily on actually outplaying your opponent on the battlefield. I myself use these tools quite often in my games of 40k, especially if I'm identifying 2 lines of play.
Curious what the math hammer is. According to this, the average damage is 3.
Adept Roll also features profile imports from both Rosterizer and New Recruit, allowing you to import your unit and attack profiles quicker and easier for faster calculations on the fly. So take control of your 40k battles with more powerful dice insight, and download Adept Roll for free on iOS or Android by following the links down in the video description.
Now, getting into the lists, we're actually going to start down in Georgia in the US with the Warzone Tucker Brewing event. This was a 60-player GT and saw undefeated results from both Chaos Demons and Necrons, both of whom we're going to be talking about today. But in this instance, I want to talk about Walter Langendorf's second place finish at 5-0 with those Necrons. Walter was playing Awakened Dynasty, the sort of original index detachment for Necrons that focuses very heavily on its characters and has a bunch of bonuses for them, including the ability to reanimate them with Protocol of the Eternal Reverent, and those characters granting bonuses to their attached units. The list included a Hexmark Destroyer, as well as Imhotep the Stormlord to generate some CP, a single Standard Overlord, 3 Psychomancers, as well as 3 Scorpek Lords, and a Technomancer. One of those Scorpek Lords was equipped with the Enagic Dermal Bond to give him a 4+ Feel No Pain, making him incredibly difficult to kill, especially since he can potentially regenerate all those wounds once killed using that previously mentioned Protocol of the Eternal Revenant, and the Technomancer with the Nether Realm Casket to give his units stealth. What's interesting here is this trio of Psychomancers. As we'll go through the list, we actually find that we don't have any attachment options for those guys, which isn't a huge loss since the only thing that you would be losing would be the bonus from the detachment ability for attaching these guys in, because they'd actually have no leadership abilities of their own. Instead, the Psychomancer is here to force mass battle shock checks on enemies. Not only are you able to bring 55-point utility units that can wander around the battlefield and potentially be respawned at the cost of a CP, but they also, at the start of any of your phases in your turn, force a battle shock check on an enemy unit with -1, which can potentially fizzle any of your opponent's defensive stratagems that they were planning to use, remove things like interrupt or overwatch from their usage, or steal objectives from them and allow you to steal them with just the Psychomancer's OC1. This is a stackable effect and does not require line of sight, so the 3 Psychomancers can be drilling 3 -1 battle shock tests on a single enemy unit within 18 inches of them every single round, which gets to the point of almost guaranteeing that those units will fail. This is a really interesting piece of technology and definitely assists the remainder of the list at taking objectives and fighting through particularly tough defensive profiles, since that mid-board objective control is something that Necrons can sometimes have trouble with outside of their hyper-resilient units. We do have one of those units in the remainder of the list, a unit of 6 Canoptek Wraiths that's going to attach in with that Technomancer. We also see a Canoptek Reanimator in here as well to assist those guys at regenerating, 2 Doomsday Arcs, a couple of utility units in the form of 2 units of Lichguard and a Flayed 1 unit. Those Lichguard units probably both attaching with the 2 Overlords in the army, both Imhotep the Stormlord and the Standard Overlord, to act as little resilient melee bricks. And then we also have 3 units of Scorpek Destroyers that can attach in with the Scorpek Lords, although sometimes we do see the Enagic Dermal Bond Scorpek Lord run independently because he's so difficult to kill that most enemies won't want to be attacking him regardless, and that allows your army to duplicate its unit count. But they're also just great melee counterpunch units by themselves. This list is super weird. Walter Langendorf always does well with Necrons and always does so with these really curious MSU-style builds, running a bunch of little units with small attached characters, and the inclusion of the Psychomancers is particularly interesting technology. Now with that, let's move over to the largest event of the weekend, the Sheffield Super Major, and talk about its winners. The event was cut to a top 8 after the first 5 rounds of play, and those remaining players played an additional 2 rounds to get to a final result of 2 undefeated. That included Gustavo Jose Branco of Varandas de Sousa with Astra Militarum, as well as Vic Vijay with Aeldari. And we're going to talk about those Aeldari first. In this case, Vic was running a Ynnari list, most of which should be relatively familiar to us at this stage. This included 2 Autarchs, both of them with Dragon Fusion guns, the Vice Arc as well as Yvrain, a single Wave Serpent, a big unit of Dark Reapers, as well as 2 smaller units of 5 Dark Reapers, 2 units of Fire Dragons, as well as 2 units of Howling Banshees for some faster melee disruption, 3 units of Rangers for forward operation and utility, as well as 3 units of Warp Spiders, a big single unit of Wind Riders, which is actually fairly interesting. It is rocking scatter lasers for the maximum infantry sweeping. Definitely helps knock down some of those light to medium infantry units that we've been seeing around the battlefield most recently. And with lethal intent, these guys can jump almost anywhere around the battlefield that they want to be in order to get shots with those things. But in addition to that, we also have 10 Ynnari Incubi that can attach in both Yvrain and the Vice Arc to get a massive number of potentially full rerolling devastating wound attacks to really act as a late game anchor. This is fairly standard for most Ynnari lists that we've been seeing, kind of a combination of these longer range guns from Dark Reapers, some counterpunch from Fire Dragons and Howling Banshees, as well as a bunch of utility to trigger inconvenient lethal intent to either move the guns out of danger, potentially move up things like this Wave Serpent into a range where it can start to disembark more aggressive units in offensive positions, or moving up that Ynnari Incubi unit so it can get into the fight. While there have been a couple of alterations made to these varieties of Ynnari, for the most part they are looking relatively similar at this point. Now with that, we're going to move over to our other undefeated placing, Gustavo Jose Branco Varandas de Sousa, playing Astra Militarum, and Gustavo was playing a combined arms regiment this time around. This is the kind of reimagining of the original index attachment for the Militarum Codex. This grants your regiment units lethal hits targeting visible enemies that are not monsters or vehicles, squadron units doing the opposite, giving you lethal hits against visible enemies that are monsters or vehicles. So basically, your little stuff is good at shooting other little stuff, your big stuff is good at shooting other big stuff. Pretty self-explanatory so far. This includes Acadian Command Squad, Militarum Tempestus Command Squad, as well as a Rogaldorn Tank Commander with Grand Strategist, allowing him to issue an additional order during each of your turns, as well as Ursula Creed to grant some additional orders and command point cost reductions. Creed is particularly good in combined regiment armies like this because of her interaction with flexible command. This allows you to pay 2 CP to make your officers eligible to order any units from any regiment or squadron units from your army, not just exclusively either regiment or squadron. And since Ursula Creed has a high number of orders, using that stratagem on her is useful. It does affect all of your officers, but the big benefit there is that when you target at least Ursula Creed or something within 12 inches of her, she's able to CP cost reduce the cost of that stratagem, which is great. The rest of the list includes a unit of Cadian shock troops to attach into. It's likely that we're putting the Cadian Command Squad alongside Ursula Creed inside that unit in order to give her access to a Master Vox, giving that unit a grand total of 4 regiment orders at 24 inches between Ursula Creed and the commander leader itself. We then also have 2 units of Catachan Jungle Fighters to add a little bit of forward operation, 2 big bricks of Death Corps of Krieg. Those are 20 models apiece. They do gain a pretty relevant bonus from this detachment. Being able to gain lethal hits against the enemy medium to heavy infantry is useful, especially once they start to gain hit bonuses and potentially even wound bonuses from taking casualties. We can also use reinforcements on them to respawn those units wholesale, bringing one of them back onto the table at full strength after it's destroyed. We have a Chimera as well as 2 Tauroxes to ferry some of those guys to the front, a Hellhound to strip cover from enemies, 2 units of Kasserkin to act as forward operators, and a pretty solid high damage output infantry unit as well, 2 Lehman Russ battle tanks to hang out with that Rogaldorn tank commander and gain squadron orders from him, as well as a unit of Tempestus Scions for the Militarum Tempestus Command Squad to jump into. Overall, this is a pretty classic variety of this style of list. We have both a combination of pretty solid high output infantry units backed up by high OC infantry units in the form of those Death Corps of Krieg. That's also backed up by a little bit of shooting from the Rogaldorn tank commander as well as those Lehman Russ battle tanks. We have a ton of transports that are going to be ferrying these guys up to the front line. We have a Chimera as well as 2 Tauroxes that can potentially embark the Kasserkin and gain scout from them, or alternatively do so with the Catachan Jungle Fighters, and then swap places with one of those other units, which is particularly effective, and gain more board presence that you can then backfill in with those Death Corpsmen of Krieg. The The aggressive play of the transports in this detachment is even made slightly better by Stalwart Protector, a very unique stratagem for combined arms, which allows your vehicles to provide cover for your infantry units. This is usable in response to an enemy target selection, so you can gain the benefit at least one time when an enemy selects one of your units as a target. Obviously, it is not stackable with go to ground, but it does affect potentially multiple of your own units, allowing a single transport if your opponent has only lined up anti-infantry shooting onto units like these Death Corps of Krieg. You can get those Death Corps of Krieg a pretty solid save with Take Cover the Order before then using Stalwart Protector to protect possibly all of them, even if they're out in the open, giving them a pretty solid armor save. That's a relatively minor use case, but if we're already throwing these transports forward in order to deliver Kazarkin units up the table, that can be a really interesting interaction to use with this detachment. Now with that, we're going to move over to the Gem Wargaming GT by the Bay, a 51-player GT from Virginia Beach, Virginia in the United States. This event was won by Alex Brudnicki running Orks, and Alex was running It's Mordaka. We already talked about it at the start of the video, and we've also talked about this list a million times. It's a Mordaka list. If you've seen one, you've basically seen them all. It's got 3 big Mexer Shock attack guns, some Pain Boys, a couple Ork units for those guys to go into, a couple little Flash units, some Gretchen to screen, 3 units of Ludas, some Storm Boys for utility, as well as 2 units of Tank Busters as well. Probably not dwell on this one too much. There's not a lot of super unique technology going into this list. It is just basically the same kind of style of Mordaka list that we've been seeing basically since the detachment dropped. So I think this list got basically hammered out almost immediately, and the particular varieties that have been seeing some play have not changed very much. I guess this one is taking more Pen Boys rather than Beast Bosses is the one difference, but that's not a huge alteration. So let's move on and talk about some Space Marines. So with that, let's go to the SALT 3 tournament. I guess that stands for the St. Louis Annual Last Minute Tournament. This was a 60-player GT being held in St. Louis, Missouri. It did see 2 undefeated players. Ryan Verbeek went undefeated with Tyranids, which we'll certainly be talking about later on in this video. But we also saw Benjamin Fredrickson from the United Midwest Project that we've actually watched take down the 8 TC team event earlier this year. Now, interestingly, all of the Ultramarine lists this week, I believe, were identical. I think they were exactly the same. And it's kind of the standard Just Roberts style of Ultramarines that we've been seeing for a while, basically since LVO. This includes a Captain in Gravis armor with Artificer armor, so he's half damage with a Field on Pain and 2+ base armor save, and free uses of stratagems like CP rerolls or Armor of Contempt, which makes him super tough to kill, so he's just a useful utility unit. A Combi Weapon Lieutenant to do Combi Weapon Lieutenant things, Marnius Calgar, and Rabute Gilliman. Marnius Calgar does have a company hero squad to protect him. We have 3 Ballistus Dreadnoughts alongside a single Gladiator Reaper, Infiltrator Squad, Invader ATV, 1 Scout Squad for forward operation and to score some points, as well as a pair of Vindicators. We've seen this one a bunch of times. It's pretty good. We got a bunch of tanks. You got to kill the tanks. In order to kill the tanks, you have to kind of move out in the open, which allows either the Ballistus Dreadnoughts to kill you or the characters to come charge you. Once you kill Marnius Calgar, who's very fast and aggressive, you likely are out of the steam to kill Rabute Gilliman, and he's able to close out the game towards the end of the game. So pretty standard stuff. Not really breaking new ground here, but still nice to see Ultramarines continue to do well. Now with that, we're going to continue to talk about Space Marines and move over to the USA Charity Cup, a 40-player GT played in Boulder City, Nevada. This one was won at 5-0 by Evan Stump playing Dark Angels. Evan was playing a Dark Angels variety of Gladius Task Force. Now this is a different beast than the previous versions of Gladius Task Force that we saw prior to the most recent update that made it so that non-compliant Space Marine chapters could not benefit from the +1 to wound. Now traditionally, Dark Angel Gladius Task Forces have been very different from the standard varieties of Space Marine Gladius Task Force because they tend to have a great appreciation for the flexibility that Gladius Task Force provides, while also being able to support that game plan with their own unique chapter units. And that's typically why we see this detachment do so well in the hands of the Dark Angels chapter. This includes Azrael, as well as a Combi Weapon Lieutenant, 3 units of Assault Jump Pack Intercessors, as well as 2 units of Deathwing Knights, a unit of 6 Inner Circle Companions. These guys are attaching in with Azrael to get their invulnerable save, as well as all of their character leadership buffs. We have 3 individual Invader ATVs to act as utility, all of those equipped with multi-meltas. 2 Repulsor Executioners, which is actually a wild inclusion in here to add some backline shooting, and a pretty strong profile of T12. That is something that Space Marines can't run into, where they fall afoul very often of kind of mid-strength, like heavy infantry sweepers, especially armies like this that are really focused on things like Inner Circle Companions and Deathwing Knights. If your opponent is rocking a bunch of Strength 9 or Strength 10 kind of multi-damage medium infantry killing weapons, they can really knock you down, but those weapons are very much less effective against these big Repulsor Executioners, who offer both screen clearing, because their defensive arrays fire just 1 trillion shots, but also can knock down heavy targets at range with their laser destroyers. We then also see 2 units of scouts and a Calidus Assassin for utility as well. Cool to see multi-Repulsor Executioners, actually, in this list. It's been a little while since we've seen those big boys on the table. Oftentimes, that slot gets taken up by a couple Ballistic Dreadnoughts or a couple varieties of Gladiators to add some long-range shooting to the fight. Occasionally, we do see Land Raiders in that spot as well in order to deliver the Deathwing Knights, but oftentimes they're okay just using their teleport homers to get up into play. What I'm also interested in is the massive number of utility units that this army is able to bring. It's rocking, in addition to 2 heavy battle tanks and basically 3 very elite infantry bricks, it's rocking 15 assault intercessors, plus 3 invader ATVs, plus 2 scout squads, plus a Calidus Assassin. So its capacity to score is phenomenal. All the while, it can back that up with very good shooting from the Repulsors, as well as very good melee from the Deathwing Knights and Inner Circle Companions. Really cool list. Nice to see this variety of Dark Angels still doing well in Gladius Task Force. I know it's a little bit of a broken record at this point about how good this detachment is, and also specifically with units like Asriel in it, available in it, but gaining access to things like reactive moves as well as damage bonuses for your Deathwing Knights is huge. Similar things can be said for the Inner Circle Companions. The fact that the detachment both buffs the ranged attacks from the big shooting units as well as the melee attacks of the heavy infantry squads means that it has very special synergy with Dark Angels, which are a chapter that tend to rely on a wide variety of attacks, be it their traditional plasma weaponry, but also backing that up with their really, really strong chapter-specific melee units. Also, gaining these relatively otherwise slow units the ability to advance and charge with Assault Doctrine is a huge deal, because that allows them to actually commit into the fight, whereas normally it would be difficult to do so. Now, with that, we're going to move over to Pensacola, Florida, and talk about the Bash at the Beach GT. This was a 39-player GT and was won by Garrett Camilleri running World Eaters. Now, sometimes we sort of gloss over World Eaters for being relatively standard, and while this list does have some hallmarks of being a regular World Eaters list, I always like to point out when the World Eaters community does interesting and cool things with their army builds. This is, first of all, it's a Vessels of Wrath detachment, not the standard Berserker warband. It is still, however, running Angron, which is kind of interesting. Sometimes we see the adage being that Vessels of Wrath gets played when you don't want to play Angron and you want to be able to take other stuff that aren't necessarily the Demon Primarch, but we have decided to just take him anyway, because he's a great beatstick. For those who don't know, this detachment allows you to select up to 3 either character units, excluding epic heroes, so not Angron or Lord Invocatus, or any of your champion models, and grant those models the Vessel of Wrath keyword. So, which also grants them access to a single unselected Blessing of Khorne, which means that you basically, whenever you need it on any of your units that still retain a unit champion, have access to any of the powerful combinations of Khornate blessings. That includes like extra movement plus advance and charge at almost all the time. You can also be gaining things like sustained hits whenever you need it, or feel no pains whenever you need it on those particular units as well. Obviously, the downside is that there is no internal synergy with Angron himself, since he cannot be selected for this special additional bonus, but he does kind of dictate the tempo of the game, since he can be so aggressive otherwise. Now, this list is also kind of leaning into the Vessels of Wrath detachment by playing a bunch of these individual units. This includes 2 Khorne Lords on Juggernauts, as well as 2 Masters of Execution. The Masters of Execution can jump into 2 units of 10 Khorne Berserkers. It's the full 10. We're not taking these little 5-mans today. We're taking the full big units. Khorne Berserker units, as long as they are near your characters, can gain Aspire to Infamy, which can give them +1 strength and AP, which is already a a pretty solid benefit, especially when compounded with the fact that you can also be generating additional blessings of Khorne for those units. And these units can also be difficult to kill, despite the fact that they are relatively low toughness. Brazen Contempt can also keep them safe from opponents shooting by making them -1 to be wounded from stronger attacks. So your opponent's kind of medium infantry sweeping, high strength blast weapons will be wounding them on 3s or 4s rather than 2s or 3s, which they would normally do. That allows more Khorne Berserkers to survive to then trigger their own Blood Surge movements and gain even further purchase into your opponent's army. We don't have any transport for these guys, which is a little surprising. We're not taking anything like rhinos in order to move them up the table, despite the fact that being embarked inside a transport is still eligible to be selected as a Vessel of Wrath. These guys probably don't necessarily need it because, as I mentioned before, they always have access to that combination of advance and charge and +2 movement, which between the two can usually get these guys up into the fight, especially alongside the fact that we do still have Lord Invocatus, so he's going to be able to point Scout at both of those units if we need it. Now, rounding out the list, we also have 2 units of Exalted 8-bound as well, which Lord Invocatus can also impact. These guys, obviously, they don't have an attached character, but they do have their unit champion who makes them eligible to become Vessels of Wrath, and basically cements this army as being unbelievably aggressive. We just have 4 enormous melee infantry bricks, 20 Khorne Berserkers, as well as 12 Exalted 8-bound. Those can all run up the table, benefiting from those additional blessings of Khorne. Plus, we have 2 Juggernaut Lords, as well as Lord Invocatus, so 3 Juggernaut-equipped characters that can run up behind them, and Angron on top of that. We have very little in the way of utility, unless you want to count those Juggernaut Lords, I guess. So, scoring secondaries is probably a lesser concern to just killing your opponent and being able to outscore them that way, which clearly worked, because again, this list did go undefeated with some relatively high scores. Now, with that, we're going to move over to Calgary, Alberta in Canada for the Fool's Errand 2025, a 64-player GT that saw 2 undefeated players, both Anthony Dalalana playing Chaos Space Marines, as well as Kos Kylie Burke playing Death Guard. We're going to start with Anthony's list, who was running Chaos Space Marines playing Creations of Bile. Now, while we have seen a little bit of a stagnation of Creations of Bile builds, this list is a little unique. This includes Cypher, Fabulous Bile himself, as well as a Chaos Lord with Prime Test Subject. Pretty standard stuff so far. That's backed up by 2 units of Legionaries, as well as a Cultist Mob, 10 Chosen for Fabulous Bile to join into, as well as 2 units of 5 Chosen and 2 units of 10 Possessed. Following that up, we have a single unit of 5 Warp Talons. These guys do love to get those benefits, those statistical benefits from the Creations of Bile detachment ability. They give you a little bit of recursive infantry sweeping, so they can kill utility units fairly reliably and then return into reserve and return back to do it again. That is obviously a pretty strong combination. We're following that up with 3 Chaos Rhinos. So while we do have many of the hallmarks of a classic Creations of Bile list, which includes this mass of relatively tough medium to heavy infantry, including the big bricks of 10 Possessed, which benefit from basically almost all of the statistical improvements that Bile can provide them, this list is playing much more of an offensive kind of staging army with these Chaos Rhinos. We are able to fill those Chaos Rhinos, probably one with the unit of 10 Chosen. I would imagine that Fabulous Bile is in there since he can improve them with his own leadership ability in order to give them additional statistical improvements on a larger swath of models. He can also make it difficult to kill them with his damage blank. We can then combine the Chosen and the Legionaries into the other Rhinos to then disembark and do what we need to on any particular turn. This allows this army to basically constantly be forcing tons of these little units down our opponent's throat, constantly be giving them 5 model units of Chosen, 5 model units of Legionnaires, or potentially even the Possessed units to deal with, keep them off balance on their objectives, and consistently generate value that way. Pretty nice to see Chaos Space Marines still putting out the work, as well as a very classic Creations of Bile build. This definitely harkens back to some of the old Pact-bound Zealot, or I guess it was Slaves to Darkness at that point, lists from early 2024 that were rocking these combinations of Legionaries and Chosen inside these Chaos Rhinos with a combination of marks to give them very similar effects that we get to just being in a Creations of Bile army. Now with that, we're going to stay on Fool's Errand for a moment here and talk about Kos Kylie Burke's Death Guard. Cass was playing a relatively infantry-focused variety of Death Guard. This included a Biologist Putrefier, Sorcerer in Terminator Armor, Foul Blightspawn, Lord of Contagion, as well as Mortarion and Typhus. Those guys were attaching into a combination of infantry units. This included one big Plague Marine squad. That Plague Marine squad could jump in with the Biologist Putrefier as well as the Foul Blightspawn for the classic combination of effects. This gives these guys 5+ criticals, lethal hits on most of their melee weapons thanks to the Biologist Putrefier, plus fight first from the Foul Blightspawn, and a pretty good infantry sweeping Plague Sprayer. That allows this unit to act as a very solid anchor. They can come out, debuff enemies with their contingents, obviously, but then hit like an absolute truck, especially if they are fighting over an infected objective, and can get sustained 2 plus lethal hits on critical 5-ups. Those heavy plague weapons inside the unit go absolutely insane at that point, and you can also get some work out of things like their Blight Launchers and Melt-A-Guns, because the Biologus Putrefier's effect impacts both their ranged and melee attacks. We have a Rhino for them to get up the table in, as well as a bunch of Cultists to act as utility, 2 units of 10 Death Guard Cultists, a couple of Predator Destructors, one of these taking Plague Heavy Bolters in order to act as a little bit more infantry sweepy, the other 2 taking Las Cannons. We followed that up with 2 units of Death Shroud Terminators, a unit of 3, as well as a unit of 5 to attach the combination of the Lord of Contagion and likely Typhus into those guys. We then also have 2 Fetid Blow Drones, as well as a unit of Poxwalkers. Fairly standard inclusions for Death Guard, I think, so far. It is nice to see the 10 model Plague Marine squad back in vogue, and clearly the combination of these units, these aggressive, relatively slow but powerful melee units between those guys and the Death Shroud Terminators, backed up by shooting from the Predator Destructors and a late game anchor in the form of Typhus, is obviously fairly strong because this list was able to go 5-0. Now with that, we are returning to the St. Louis annual last minute tournament, SALT 3, where we are going to talk about the first place finisher Ryan Verbeck, who absolutely dominated the event with Tyranids with an insane score, 2 100-point wins, as well as all of his other wins being 90-plus points. That's wild. Ryan was playing a Synaptic Nexus, a detachment I have not seen for a long time. This includes a Hive Tyrant with Synaptic Control to give him a -1 damage effect to make him significantly more difficult to deal with, especially given the fact that you could use Reinforced Hive Node on him free with his own CP discount aura. He can be a 2+ armor save, potentially benefiting from cover, potentially benefiting from that Armor of Contempt effect, and -1 damage, and makes that little guy, despite the fact that his top line profile is not that impressive in terms of its survivability, actually a little tough to remove. We follow that up with a Nero Tyrant with Power of the Hive Mind to improve the strength of its big flamethrower attack, a unit of Hormagaunts, a Biovore, a Haru Specs, 1 Lictor, a unit of 20 Nerogaunts. These guys can spread that Synapse effect around to spread all of the detachment's auras if they need to from their Synaptic Imperatives. They also act as a phenomenal late game screen. We have a single Neurolictor, 3 Norn Emissaries. These can compound the resilience granted from Reinforced Hive Node to give them an Armor of Contempt effect with their own pretty already strong defensive characteristics, high saves, feel no pain when they're on their singular purpose objective. I think that this detachment was kind of made for them. They also have 2+ weapon skill, ballistic skill, and you can use the stratagem to give reroll once to hit and wound against a particular target to make them very effective, both in shooting with their melted weapons as well as their melee attacks. So that's sometimes a combination that gets played. It is cool to see the massive of Norn Emissary season play here. We have 2 Psychophages as well as a big unit of Zoanthropes, where that Nero Tyrant is likely to be hopping into to grant his +1 to wound. Again, we can give these guys things like reroll once they hit and wound, which does make a unit of 2+ ballistic skill Zoanthropes particularly effective. Those guys are even going to be tough to kill because of the Psychophages, which can give them a Feel No Pain. They can also buff the Norn Emissaries with a Feel No Pain before it gets stuck in to its singular purpose objective. And those guys even act as a little bit of a utility unit that potentially forces your opponent to overcommit to kill them, because they are relatively difficult to kill for their points value, which allows you to counterpunch with things like the Zoanthropes. Really cool to see this variety of Tyranids see some play. It's been a long time since we've seen Synaptic Nexus on the table. Most of the time it's been Invasion Fleet or some manner of Assimilation Swarm or potentially Vanguard Invasion, but clearly Ryan was able to find some gems inside this detachment. Now with that, we are returning to the Warzone Tucker Brewing to talk about Stephen Mitchell and his Chaos Demons. I appreciate the title of Stephen's list here. I wish I was good enough to play Shadow Legion, because we are talking about a pretty wild version of this faction, not talking about the relatively standard Shadow Legion that we're seeing play now, or even the more finesse-oriented varieties of Demonic Incursion that we've been seeing crop up. Stephen instead was playing a Plague Legion detachment. This is the Nurgle-focused detachment that is focused on battle-shocking out your opponent's enemies. But given the fact that Nurgle units saw a massive statistical glow-up in the March update that basically rewrote the entire Nurgle section of the Demons Index, it stands to reason that this detachment, like likely has some secret spice hidden within it. This includes Epidemius, who's going to generate UCP as you kill units with your Nurgle units. Most of the list is Nurgle units, so that just makes sense. We also have 2 Great Unclean Ones. One of them with the Font of Spores to improve the armor penetration characteristics of all your Nurgle demons within an aura around him, affecting both their melee and ranged attacks, putting Great Unclean One attacks up to an impressive AP 3, and given the fact that they just got a strength buff in the most recent update, as well as have their own toughness reducing abilities, these guys are actually going to hit like trucks once this effect is applied. We also have the Droning Shroud on the other Great Unclean One, which gives him essentially Bellacor's Lord of Shadow aura, so you're not able to attack him or anyone within 6 inches of him if you are not within 18 inches of the target. We then have Rodigus as our 3rd Great Unclean One, a Poxbringer, Sloppity Bile Piper with Canker Blight to use against enemy heavy infantry or mounted units, which can destroy entire enemy models when they fail battle shock checks, instead of dealing mortal wounds to the unit, as well as the Changeling for a lone operative utility. We have a unit of Blue Horrors acting as some utility with infiltration, so we can get a little bit of forward operation in the army. 3 units of 10 Plague Bearers. Interestingly, no Nurglings this time around. Those Blue Horrors can perform actions and can hold objectives, though, so they are significantly more useful when it comes to scoring objectives, as well as move blocking enemies than Nurglings are. Following that up, we also have a Beast of Nurgle, so for some additional utility, and 2 Nurgle Soul Grinders. Those Soul Grinders are going to get the benefit of things like the Font of Spores, so they are going to be getting that +1 AP on even their ranged attacks, which includes their Harvester Cannon, as well as their Indirect Fire Phlegm Bombardment. So, unlike many demon lists, this variety is able to start applying damage from the very beginning of the game. It forces you to come up and engage with it. It's also going to be protecting its units from shooting with the Droning Shroud, threatening objective securement with those Plague Bearers, forcing you to come close to it, and once you're close to it, it's going to start forcing additional battle shock checks on you, dealing additional mortal wounds, or even potentially killing entire models from your units thanks to the Canker Blight on the Sloppity Bile Piper. Really interesting build of list here. It's always fun to talk about these Plague Legion builds because they're just so wild compared to most of the really kind of flighty and dancey style of demons that we've been seeing more recently. But these lists, just putting it all out on the table and slapping around your opponent, is super cool. Now with that, let's move over to Thailand and talk about the Phuket Open. This was a 60-player GT and was won by Victor Ko running Grey Knights. And this isn't any variety of Grey Knights because we have the return of Teleport Strike Force. It has been, I think, going on 6 months now since Warpbane Task Force was released. Teleport Strike Force got simultaneously nerfed, and I don't believe I have seen it played once in more modern formats since those changes went down, and it is so wild to see it back on the table now. So let's talk about what this detachment does, because people might have actually forgotten. Teleport Strike Force gives you on-the-board movement buffs for your Grey Knight units. You're able to gain auto 6 advances, and you count as flying while you're advancing. That's pretty cute, but the real power lies in its enhancements and its stratagems. It did get a little bit of a nerf in that it has True Silver Armor, a Armor of Contempt style of effect, which did get reduced to coming into play for a single activation rather than being phase long as we saw it in the past. However, you can entirely dictate your opponent's game plan with stratagems like Mists of Deimos, which can remove your units in response to enemy movement within 9 inches of them, or the Sigil of Exigence, which allows a Grand Master to teleport his unit out of danger upon being targeted by a ranged attack. This makes this detachment significantly more pillow-fisted than Warpbane Task Force, but much more of a nightmare to play against, because unlike Warpbane Task Force, where the units are going to stand on the table and fight you, just gaining a bunch of beneficial rerolls for doing so, you're going to have to constantly be playing around these movement shenanigans, playing against Teleport Strike Force. So what did we play in this build? This included a Brotherhood Tech Marine, a standard Foot Grandmaster with Sigil of Exigence, alongside a Nemesis Grandmaster and Kaldor Drago. We had 2 units of Brotherhood Terminators, 1 unit of 5, as well as a unit of 10 to attach those Terminator characters into. One of them would get the Grandmaster, who could redeploy his unit in response to being shot, which allows you to play more aggressively with the Terminators and force your opponent to play around that, giving themselves multiple targets if they ever want to target that particular Terminator squad. You can oftentimes create situations where that is the only thing your opponent opponent can target. So if they want to expose themselves and break their screens in order to attack you, you're just going to pull out of the fight and then respond with your other units in reserve and counterpunch them later on. We then have a unit of 10 Brotherhood Terminators as well. Sometimes we see these guys being played with Khaldor Drago. You can play them very aggressively. They can use their additional 3-inch bonus to charge, get into melee, nuke something with the Brotherhood Terminator's ability to get lethal hits on the charge, then use Mists of Deimos very aggressively because you want to get up close and personal with basically as much of your opponent's army as possible. When they come in to counterpunch you Mists of Deimos away and then rapid ingress at the end of that movement phase to then get a second subsequent charge later on in that phase, which makes this unit able to potentially charge back-to-back turns and do absolutely insane damage. And even incidental damage that they receive is going to get mitigated by the apothecaries in those Terminator squads. We then have a strike squad, 3 Nemesis Dread Knights to get buffed up by that Tech Marine, as well as a Calidus Assassin for some utility as well. Otherwise, pretty standard teleport strike force stuff. It's just cool that we are seeing this detachment see some play after it being out of the competitive scene for so long. Now, with that, we're going to move all the way down to Australia and talk about the ITA singles FoolCon GT. This was a 38-player GT and was won by Roger Burkett running Imperial Knights. It feels like Australia and New Zealand are the final holdouts of the Knight metagame. We're seeing Chaos Knights and Imperial Knights do fairly well in those metas, even though their play incidence has dropped somewhat in other metas. That said, we did see a little bit of an uptick when players started comboing them with Sisters of Battle and Immolators from Agents of the Imperium. We'll see if that comes back around. I think potentially if we see a change to Mordaka in the future, we might see more Imperial Knights take the field. But I think right now they're just being killed by Mordaka armies, so that kind of makes sense. Anyway, Roger Burkett was playing a Knight Castellan with Revered Knight. This is a relatively inexpensive 15-point enhancement that provides a +1 leadership aura within 6 inches of the Knight and potentially up to 12 inches if your army has become honored. We then have a Knight Errant with Mysterious Guardian. It's the Knight Deep Strike and up-down once per game, alongside a Knight Warden with a combination of Avenger Gatling Cannon and Thunderstrike Gauntlet. Following that up, we have a bunch of Armigers. 1 Armiger Helvrin, as well as 3 Armiger Warglaves, and last but certainly not least, a Colexus Assassin. Pretty interesting to see the triple big Knight list, including even a Knight Castellan. It's been a while since we've seen that guy see some play. Interestingly, we are seeing Mysterious Guardian played on him. I see that as a combination played fairly often in these Knight lists. In order to place him up aggressively, use the maneuverability granted by Mysterious Guardian to always get him good lines of sight for his absolutely phenomenal damage output with that big combination of Plasma Decimator and Volcano Lance, and then be able to redeploy into annoying spots. Your opponent can come back and kill him, but you can set up to counterpunch anything that kills the Castellan, and Castellans are very difficult to take down with their base 2+ armor save. We're not doing that in this case. It looks like he's going to be playing a little bit more as a babysitter for the Armigers themselves, and instead we're going to be playing the Errant and the Warden a little bit more aggressively, which is fascinating. Also, important to note, no Canis Rex in this list. Not playing the character Knight either, so we're just rocking the standard Knight profiles and running up the table at your opponent, and clearly that works fairly well. And with that, let's move over to some supporter Q&A. Huge thanks to everybody who supports Tactical Tortoise, whether that's over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise or on my YouTube channel membership. I have started doing a Q&A section at the end of these videos for folks who are supporting at either of those places. So if you are interested in getting featured on this section, go ahead and join down there. And I drop Q&A posts before I record these videos. This week's question comes from Marcus Loss6937, who's commented, "Custodies are a bane of mine. I like to play big monster demons or vehicle elite armies like Imperial Knights. They seem to be a fantastic counter, and the meta has armies that just do better into certain lists. What do you advise when your opponent has an advantage on you from the start of the game?" This is a great question, and is, I think, a very relevant concern for a lot of people, especially people like me who are teamies at heart, who just play big stompy stuff. I think Marcus and I basically have exactly the same list building philosophy when it comes to games of 40k. And in this case, the best advice that I can give is when your opponent is statted to kill you on a raw profile matchup, the best thing you can do is simply not to engage with them. If in a stand-up fight your opponent is just going to kill you, for example, they're taking a ton of Custodian Wardens and Custodian Guard, and all you have is these big, melee demons to fight them, the goal becomes not actually fighting them in a straight-up fight. It becomes more of a scoring-oriented game. So the goal is to draw the game out for as long as possible before your opponent is able to leverage those attacks. Keep your models outside your opponent's threat range, use move blocking and use your intervening screens to prevent them from being able to get easy or good charges into you or engage with their most powerful weapons against you, and only take fights in situations where you can be assured that you are utilizing the majority of your army to take out specific individual enemy units. Now, to some extent, getting hit by these profile matchups becomes inevitable as the game goes on, but if you can draw the game out until round 3, round 4, towards the late game before your opponent is actually able to leverage the benefit that they have over you, that gives you the greatest opportunity to outscore them. Playing Big Chaos Demons, you actually run into situations like these all the time because there are very specific profiles that are incredibly good against them. Things that are very high volume, especially with wound bonuses or lethal hits and stuff like that, and relatively low AP is absolutely brutal to demons. And you do end up having to play these weird cat and mouse games, oftentimes where you simply don't engage with your big demons. So instead of simply moving to objectives and standing on them, keeping yourself out of range or keeping screening units intervening can make it so that they have to overextend in order to actually do anything. And otherwise, we'll have to take additional turns to move up the table and potentially expose themselves to shooting. Really great question, Marcus, and I hope you end up figuring out those matchups. But with that, that's going to be it for this video. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video, and big thanks as well to Adept Roll for sponsoring this video. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.